Cowboy refused a virgin. He chose the woman the town tried to break Tom Reynolds' road into Cedar Creek just as the sun was dipping behind the distant hills, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. The horse beneath him was strong and steady, but Tom had the kind of calm that made it clear he was not in a hurry. He had traveled many miles across open plains, through dusty trails and quiet forests, and he carried with him a quiet confidence that came from knowing how to face any challenge life threw his way. He wasn't a man who sought attention, but somehow, wherever he went, people noticed him. Cedar Creek was a small town, built around a single dusty main street with wooden storefronts that creaked with the wind. The town had that kind of stillness that made everyone's life feel exposed. Nothing happened without everyone knowing about it by sunset. Windows were always open, and the townsfolk liked to watch newcomers carefully, trying to decide if they were trustworthy or trouble. Tom had heard stories about towns like this, but he had never let them bother him. He didn't care what people thought. He cared only about who people really were, beneath their words and appearances. The first person to see him was the town blacksmith, a tall man with a broad chest and thick arms. He stopped hammering and squinted at Tom from across the street. "New in town?" the blacksmith called. Tom tipped his hat politely. "Just passing through," he said. His voice was steady, calm, and easy to listen to. Even in passing, it had a sort of authority that made people stop and pay attention. As he led his horse down the street, he noticed the way the townspeople glanced at him, some curious, some wary. Children peeked from behind doors, and shopkeepers paused mid-task to watch him pass. Tom didn't rush. He wanted to get a feel for the town, the kind of quiet understanding that came from observing before speaking. It wasn't long before he felt eyes on him that weren't filled with just curiosity. There was something more. Her name was Emily Harper. She stood near the well at the edge of town, filling a wooden bucket with water. Her hair was dark and slightly tangled, and her hands were rough from work, but there was something about her that made her stand out. People often whispered about Emily. She had a reputation, some cruel stories the town spread about her, stories that weren't true but stuck because people liked to judge. She had been hurt before, and everyone in Cedar Creek seemed to think they could decide who she should be. Most townsfolk avoided her, some even mocked her quietly, but Tom noticed her strength. He noticed the way she didn't run from their whispers, the way she kept going even when others tried to make her feel small. Tom dismounted from his horse and led it to the stable at the edge of town. The stable was simple, made of rough wood, but it was a safe place to leave his horse while he walked through the town. As he patted the horse's neck, he thought about what it meant to arrive in a new place. In his experience, towns like this had a rhythm, and he liked to feel it before becoming part of it. There were unspoken rules, stories, and patterns that only revealed themselves to those who watched closely. Walking through the town square, he passed the small general store. Mrs. Thompson, who ran it, gave him a cautious smile. "You're new, aren't you?" she asked. Her voice was curious but polite, the way people often spoke to someone who could either be trouble or a friend. Tom nodded. "Yes, ma'am, just here for a few days," he said. He looked around, taking in the details. The chipped paint on the windows, the little signs advertising eggs and flour, the creaking of the boards beneath his boots. Emily had finished at the well by this time and had begun walking down the street, carrying her bucket carefully. Tom noticed her again. There was something in the way she moved, careful but unhurried, like someone who had learned to be strong through experience. He couldn't explain why, but he felt drawn to her, not in the way of a fleeting curiosity, but something deeper, like recognizing a kindred spirit. As he continued walking, he could hear the whispers begin. Cedar Creek thrived on stories, and every newcomer quickly became part of 100 small conversations. "That's the new cowboy," someone said from a porch. "He looks quiet." Another voice added, "I hear he's good with a horse and a gun." "Might be trouble." Tom smiled faintly to himself. He had heard this before. People liked to judge what they didn't understand. He didn't mind. By the time he reached the saloon at the end of the street, the sun was almost gone. The saloon was lively with the usual chatter, the clinking of glasses, and the low hum of a piano. Tom paused at the door, listening. It was the kind of place where secrets floated freely in the air, where everyone had a story, and where he could learn a lot if he simply watched. He stepped inside. People noticed him immediately. It wasn't just his appearance, though the wide-brimmed hat, leather vest, and worn boots certainly made him stand out. it was his presence. He moved with calm assurance, yet there was a softness in his eyes that made people feel like they could trust him. The bartender, a burly man named Hank, nodded toward him. "First time here?" Hank asked. Tom nodded again, and Hank poured him a cup of coffee, strong and black, exactly the way Tom liked it. As Tom sipped his coffee, he kept his eyes on the crowd. That's when he saw her again, Emily, sitting quietly at a corner table. She wasn't loud or seeking attention, but she had a presence that drew him in. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she flinched slightly when someone laughed too loudly nearby, and the way her eyes watched the room cautiously. There was pain there, yes, but also resilience. He admired that in a person. It wasn't easy to keep moving forward when the world seemed set against you. It didn't take long for Tom to realize something about Cedar Creek. People had their favorites, their chosen ones who fit neatly into the town's stories of respectability. And then there were those like Emily who didn't fit, who were unfairly judged, and who had to fight quietly just to be seen as human. Tom didn't care about the town's opinions. He cared about truth. He cared about seeing people for who they were, not who the world said they should be. As the evening wore on, he struck up small conversations with a few townsfolk, learning about the town's history, its people, and its unspoken rules. Some were friendly, others guarded. Everyone had their eyes on him, trying to figure out what kind of man he was. And through it all, Tom noticed Emily watching him from her corner. She didn't smile at first, didn't approach, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. Tom smiled faintly back. He didn't need to say anything yet. He knew some things were understood without words. When it was time to leave, Tom stepped out into the cool night air. The town was quiet, except for the occasional sound of a horse stamping in a stable or a dog barking in the distance. He mounted his horse again, glancing once more at Emily before turning toward the inn where he would stay. He felt something stir inside him, a mix of curiosity and respect for this woman who had endured so much without losing herself. He knew somehow that their paths were not going to be simple, but then he had never been one for simple paths. Tom didn't realize it yet, but Cedar Creek had begun to take notice, not just of him, but of the choices he would make and the quiet strength of the woman who had captured his attention. It was a town full of stories, and he had just become part of one, though he didn't yet know how. One thing was certain. He had arrived, and things in Cedar Creek were about to change, not because he wanted to, but because he saw things differently, and sometimes seeing differently is the first step to changing everything. The morning after Tom arrived, Cedar Creek seemed even. Quieter than usual. Sunlight spilled over the wooden rooftops, and a thin mist hovered over the dirt streets. Tom stepped out of the small inn where he had stayed, stretched his shoulders, and took a deep breath of the crisp air. He had slept well, but he knew that in a town like this, first impressions mattered. Today would be about learning more, not just about the people, but about the unspoken rules that shaped their lives. As he walked toward the town square, he noticed the townsfolk already beginning their day. Shopkeepers swept the boards in front of their stores, children chased each other along the street, and men loaded horses and wagons for work on the outskirts of town. Everyone watched him. Some curiosity was friendly, but others carried suspicion. Cedar Creek was small, and newcomers were always observed carefully, as if their character needed to be measured before they could be trusted. Tom didn't mind. He had learned long ago that quiet observation often revealed more than words ever could. Emily Harper was at the well again, filling her bucket for the day's chores. She looked up as Tom approached, and he gave her a polite nod. Her eyes widened slightly, and for a brief moment there was something in her expression, a flicker of surprise or hope, that caught him off guard. Most people in Cedar Creek didn't look at her kindly. They whispered about her, judged her, and treated her as if she were fragile or broken. But Tom didn't see fragility. He saw strength. He saw someone who had endured hardship without letting it destroy her spirit. He walked past her slowly, tipping his hat in greeting. "Morning," he said simply. Emily nodded, murmuring a quiet reply. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. Tom felt a strange connection already, though it was quiet, almost imperceptible. There was something honest about her presence, something real that didn't try to impress or hide behind appearances. He had met people like this before, people who carried their dignity quietly, even when the world seemed against them. As Tom wandered toward the general store, he overheard snippets of conversation from the townsfolk. "That cowboy think he'll stay long?" asked one woman to another. "He seems different," the other replied. "Not the kind to be fooled by appearances." Tom didn't react. He didn't need to. People would talk whether he wanted them to or not. What mattered to him was truth, and he was careful to seek that, not rumor. Inside the store, Mrs. Thompson greeted him warmly. "Coffee or something else?" she asked. Tom shook his head politely. "Just looking for supplies. I'll need a few things for the week." He glanced at the shelves: flour, sugar, some preserved vegetables, a few sacks of coffee beans, and other essentials. Mrs. Thompson watched him closely. "You seem careful," she said. "Not the kind who rushes into trouble." Tom smiled faintly. "I've learned it's better to watch before acting," he said. As he walked out of the store with a few items tucked into a small bag, he noticed Clara, the town's well-regarded young woman, standing near the fountain. She had the kind of smile that made people admire her immediately. Her hair was perfectly combed, her dress neat and tidy, and her posture flawless. People often said she was the ideal young woman of Cedar Creek, polite, obedient, and ready to marry someone respectable. Tom noticed her as anyone would, but he didn't feel drawn to her. Her perfection seemed distant. He wanted something real, something that had survived hardship. Emily, on the other hand, caught his attention again. She was carrying her bucket carefully, balancing it as she moved with a quiet determination. Tom realized the town had already begun its subtle campaign. They whispered behind hands, suggesting that he should do the right thing by courting Clara. He heard a few men talking, saying, "If he's smart, he'll choose her. Everyone expects it." Tom frowned slightly. He didn't want to upset anyone, but he also knew that his heart couldn't be influenced by gossip or expectation. By midday, the town square was busier. Merchants sold fresh bread and fruits, children played games, and the townsfolk exchanged stories about life, work, and the occasional scandal. Tom walked slowly through it all, noticing who smiled genuinely and who hid their true feelings. Emily moved through the crowd with quiet grace, avoiding most of the gossipers, but still aware of every glance thrown her way. Tom admired her ability to stay composed despite the constant judgment. Later that afternoon, a group of townsfolk gathered near the saloon, talking in hushed tones about Emily. Some whispered cruelly about her past, while others shook their heads, uncomfortable with the gossip but unwilling to speak up. Tom overheard part of it and clenched his jaw slightly. He had seen this before, people trying to shape someone's story to fit their own sense of morality. It frustrated him because he knew that true character wasn't defined by rumor or mistake, but by courage and resilience. Emily noticed him watching and gave a small, fleeting nod. Tom returned the gesture. It wasn't much, but it was a silent understanding. No one needed to know the depth of it yet. In a town like Cedar Creek, subtle connections were safer than loud declarations. For Emily, every day was a balancing act, moving between her own dignity and the town's judgment. For Tom, every day was about learning who people really were beneath the surface. By evening, the town held its usual gathering at the saloon. Music played softly in the corner, and laughter echoed from the tables. Tom entered and immediately felt the familiar weight of attention. People watched him, trying to determine if he would follow the town's expectations or challenge them. He noticed Clara smiling at him from a table with a few friends, clearly hoping he would approach. But his eyes kept returning to Emily, who sat quietly, reading a small book she had found in a corner. A few townsfolk came over to introduce themselves, curious about the newcomer. Tom greeted each politely, answered their questions honestly, and asked about life in Cedar Creek. He didn't boast about his skills or his past. He simply observed, listened, and learned. This calm confidence intrigued some people and irritated others. But Emily watched him the most. She saw that he wasn't like the others. He didn't follow the rules of gossip, he didn't judge based on appearance, and he didn't expect her to apologize for being who she was. As the night wore on, Tom found himself near Emily's table. He spoke softly, asking about her day, her work, and her life in the town. Emily was cautious at first, but there was a warmth in his voice that made her relax slightly. They spoke quietly, avoiding the attention of the other townsfolk. For the first time in a long while, Emily felt seen, not for what people said about her, but for who she truly was. Meanwhile, whispers circulated among the townsfolk. Some were shocked that Tom was paying attention to Emily instead of Clara. "Why would he talk to her?" someone murmured. "He should choose someone respectable," said another, but Tom didn't hear them. He had already decided that he valued truth and resilience over appearances. He admired strength and honesty, and Emily had both in abundance. By the time the saloon emptied, the night sky was full of stars, and Cedar Creek had quieted once more. Tom walked Emily to the edge of town, keeping the conversation light but meaningful. She felt a sense of relief and curiosity she hadn't felt in years. There was no judgment in his words, only a genuine interest in who she was as a person. It was a rare gift in a town that often measured people by rumor and reputation. When they reached her modest home, Emily stopped, hesitant. "Thank you for talking with me," she said softly. Tom nodded. "I meant it. People often forget to see the truth, and I try not to." There was a pause, comfortable and honest. "Good night, Tom," she said, stepping inside. Tom watched her go, thinking about the strength it took to live in a place like this. Cedar Creek was full of judgment, but he saw past it, and somehow that made the town feel a little smaller and a little kinder. As he rode back to the inn under the cool night sky, Tom thought about the subtle tension building in the town. The whispers would not stop, the judgment would continue, and some people would try to push him toward what they thought was right. But he had already made a quiet decision in his mind. He would not be swayed by gossip, by expectation, or by fear. He respected Emily's courage, and that respect would guide his actions more than anything else. For Emily, the day had been unusual. She had not smiled freely, she had not been loud, but she had been seen. And that small act of recognition, the simple acknowledgement that she mattered, had given her hope she didn't know she still carried. For the first time in a long while, she wondered if perhaps life could be more than surviving the town's judgment. Tom didn't yet know what the future held in Cedar Creek, but one thing was clear. This town, with all its whispers and expectations, would have to adjust to the truth of his choices. And in that quiet determination, both he and Emily felt the first hints of change, a small spark that could grow into something neither of them had dared to imagine before. The next morning, Cedar Creek seemed unusually restless. A soft wind rattled the wooden signs on the street, and the smell of freshly baked bread and coffee filled the air. Tom Reynolds stepped out of the inn, his boots crunching on the dirt road, and took a moment to observe the town. He had begun to understand the rhythm here. People moved predictably, their conversations filled with judgment, expectation, and gossip. Yet beneath it all, he could sense a subtle undercurrent of fear and hope, a mix that shaped every glance and whisper. Emily Harper was at the well just as she had been the day before. Her movements were precise, almost graceful, though the weight of the water bucket tested her strength. When she saw Tom approaching, her eyes flickered with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. She did not smile, but there was something unspoken between them now, a small acknowledgement that yesterday's conversation had mattered. Tom tipped his hat. "Good morning," he said softly. Emily inclined her head. "Morning," she replied, her voice quiet but steady. The town was beginning to take notice of them. A few townsfolk watched from doorways, whispering to each other. "That cowboy talking to her again," one said. "Why doesn't he speak with Clara? She's respectable." Another muttered, "He's different." "He doesn't care about what people say?" Tom heard none of it. He had no interest in gossip. His attention was only on Emily, not on her reputation, but on her courage and the honesty in her eyes. By mid-morning, a group of townsfolk gathered near the saloon, their voices low but insistent. Emily's past had been a source of endless whispers, and they were determined to make it a topic again. A few older women shook their heads, muttering about how a woman like Emily was unfit for the kind of attention a man like Tom deserved. Some of the men nodded in agreement, quietly warning that a relationship with her would cause trouble. Tom stood at a distance, listening. He felt a simmering anger not at the townsfolk but at the unfairness of their judgment. It was clear that Emily was being punished for things beyond her control, and he refused to accept it silently. Later that afternoon, Tom visited the general store. Mrs. Thompson greeted him warmly. "You're still spending time with Emily, aren't you?" she asked, her voice both cautious and curious. Tom nodded. "I see something in her, something real. I don't care about what others think." Mrs. Thompson smiled faintly. "Not many men would do that," Tom shrugged. "I've never been one to follow what's expected. I care about truth." He left the store with a few supplies, feeling more certain of his intentions with every passing day. Emily was walking through the town square when she saw him again. He approached slowly, deliberately careful not to draw unnecessary attention. "I didn't see you at the well today," Tom said. Busy morning? Emily shook her head. Just some chores. The well isn't the only work in this town. Her eyes met his, and for a moment the noise and judgment of the town fell away. They walked together quietly, side by side, without speaking too much. Words were unnecessary. They understood the weight of the town's gaze and the courage it took simply to exist in it. By evening, the tension in Cedar Creek had grown. A town dance was scheduled in the saloon, and it was one of those events where everyone came together, but under the surface, judgment and gossip were exchanged freely. Tom knew that attending would be risky, not in terms of danger, but in terms of making a stand. Emily had been shunned at previous gatherings, her presence often mocked or ignored. Yet he felt that tonight things could change, if only subtly. He wanted to show that he saw her worth, and he wanted the town to see it too. When Tom entered the saloon, heads turned immediately. People noticed the calm confidence in his stride, the way he carried himself without arrogance. He scanned the room and saw Emily sitting in her usual corner, quietly observing, her hands resting on the table in front of her. He moved toward her, ignoring the curious glances of the townsfolk, and offered a polite nod. "Evening, Emily," he said softly. "May I join you?" Emily looked at him, surprised but pleased. "Of course," she replied, her voice steady. Tom sat across from her, careful not to draw attention, yet aware that the entire room seemed to be watching. It didn't take long for some townsfolk to murmur. "Why is he sitting with her?" one woman asked. "He should be dancing with Clara," said another. The whispers spread quickly, though Tom didn't flinch. He kept his focus on Emily, noticing the slight tension in her shoulders and the careful way she adjusted her posture to avoid confrontation. He admired her restraint and her courage, qualities that had been overlooked by everyone else. As the music began, a few couples moved to the floor, spinning and laughing. Tom and Emily remained seated, talking quietly about simple things, the weather, the chores, and the small routines of life in Cedar Creek. There was no need for elaborate conversation. The simplicity of their words carried meaning. They shared smiles and small laughs, and Emily felt something she hadn't felt in years. A sense of being accepted for who she truly was, not for the town's expectations of her. Then came the turning point. One of the town elders, a man who prided himself on his knowledge of gossip and propriety, approached Emily's table. His expression was stern, almost disapproving. "Emily Harper," he said loudly enough for several nearby people to hear, "I don't know why you think you belong at this gathering. Some of us think you should leave before you embarrass yourself." Emily flinched slightly but did not move. She had endured this kind of judgment before, but Tom saw the pain in her eyes. Tom stood immediately, placing a hand gently on Emily's shoulder. "I don't think she's going anywhere," he said, his voice firm but calm. The room fell silent. All eyes turned toward him. The elder's face reddened with anger. "And who are you to decide that?" he demanded. Tom looked him directly in the eye. "I'm someone who sees the truth. Emily Harper is a good, strong person. She doesn't deserve your judgment, and neither do you." A hush fell over the saloon. The townsfolk realized that Tom was serious, that he wasn't someone who could be easily intimidated or swayed by tradition and gossip. Emily's eyes widened slightly, a mixture of surprise and relief crossing her face. No one had defended her so openly in years. The elder scowled but eventually stepped back, mumbling under his breath as Tom returned to his seat. Emily felt a warmth in her chest, the kind of warmth that came from being truly seen. For the rest of the evening, Tom stayed by Emily's side. He engaged in small, polite conversation with other townsfolk, but always made sure Emily was included, respected, and safe from further humiliation. Slowly, some of the younger townsfolk began to notice, realizing that maybe the stories they had heard about Emily weren't the whole truth. The town had never seen someone like Tom before, someone willing to stand up quietly but firmly for what was right. By the time the dance ended, Emily and Tom walked out together. The night air was cool and refreshing, carrying the faint smell of pine from the nearby hills. Emily felt lighter than she had in years. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything tonight." Tom nodded. "You didn't need saving. You're stronger than you think. I just made sure others could see it too." As they reached the edge of town, Tom paused. "Cedar Creek has its ways," he said, his voice calm. "Some people will never understand, but that doesn't mean they get to decide your worth. You've survived more than most, and that matters more than anyone's opinion." Emily looked at him, feeling a mixture of gratitude and admiration. I never thought someone would see me like that," she admitted. Tom smiled faintly. "It only takes one person to start the change, and sometimes that person is you. But tonight it was both of us." Emily nodded, understanding that the evening had been more than just a dance. It had been a quiet revolution of respect, a small but significant stand against unfair judgment. Tom rode back to the inn under the clear, star-filled sky, thinking about the town's reaction. Cedar Creek would not easily forget what had happened. Some would gossip, some would resist, but others would begin to question their assumptions. Emily's strength, combined with his choice to stand beside her, had created a ripple that could grow into lasting change. For the first time, he felt certain that his presence in this town was meaningful, not because of what he had accomplished, but because of the truth he had helped reveal. Emily returned home, her heart lighter but her thoughts full of possibility. She realized that for the first time someone saw her without prejudice, someone recognized her strength and her worth. And with that recognition, a small spark of hope began to grow, a hope that perhaps the town could be different, that maybe she could have a place in it without losing herself. The night ended with a quiet sense of victory. Tom had made his first stand, not through confrontation or anger, but through calm courage and unwavering respect. Emily had begun to believe in herself again, encouraged by someone who refused to follow the town's narrow expectations. And Cedar Creek, though slow to change, had witnessed the first crack in its wall of judgment, a crack that could grow into something much larger if nurtured carefully. The days after the town dance were not easy for Emily Harper. Even though Tom Reynolds had stood by her side in the saloon, Cedar Creek's whispers did not stop. In fact, they seemed to grow louder. People lingered in doorways, exchanged quiet glances, and murmured as she walked down the streets. Some of the older townsfolk shook their heads in disapproval, while others simply watched her as if waiting for a misstep. Emily had grown used to judgment over the years, but this felt different. For the first time, someone had defended her, someone had shown that her worth was real, and she began to see that maybe she did not have to live under the town's shadow forever. Tom noticed the tension immediately. He had spent enough time in places like Cedar Creek to know that change rarely came quickly. People cling to old stories, especially those that make them feel superior. But he also knew that courage, quiet, steady courage, was contagious. He began to walk with Emily when he could, keeping an eye on her and gently countering the whispers with kindness and respect. Even small gestures mattered. A polite greeting, a warm smile, a shared laugh. They reminded Emily that not everyone was judging her unfairly. One morning, as Emily carried water from the well, a group of women standing near the general store began to whisper louder than usual. "Why does he even bother with her?" one said. "He could have chosen Clara, someone proper, someone respectable." Another added, "He's making trouble for himself and for her." Emily tried to keep walking, but the weight of their judgment pressed down on her. She felt the familiar sting of shame, though she had done nothing wrong. She had learned to endure these moments, to keep her head high even when the town seemed determined to push her down. Tom appeared just then, riding slowly toward her on his horse. He dismounted and approached with that calm confidence that seemed to make people notice without being threatening. "Good morning, Emily," he said, his voice gentle. She looked at him, relief washing over her. "Morning," she replied. She had come to rely on these small moments, where he reminded her that she was more than the town's opinion. "They're whispering again," Emily said quietly, almost apologetically. Tom shook his head. "Let them talk. It doesn't change who you are, and it doesn't change who I see. You're strong, Emily, and it's about time someone noticed that." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that made her chest feel lighter. For the first time in a long while, she believed that perhaps the town's judgment didn't define her. But not everyone was willing to accept change. That afternoon at the saloon, a few men from the town approached Tom. Their faces were stern, their voices low but sharp. "We hear you've been paying a lot of attention to Emily Harper," one said. "You need to understand that it's complicated. Some things in this town are best left alone." Tom met their eyes steadily. "I understand more than you think. I also understand that Emily is a good person and she doesn't deserve your judgment." The men shifted uncomfortably. Tom's calm confidence was a shield they could not easily pierce. "You'll bring trouble to yourself," another warned. "And to her," Tom nodded slowly. "I'm aware of that." But some things are worth the trouble, truth, respect, and seeing people for who they really are. He turned and walked back toward Emily, who had been watching quietly from a corner of the saloon. She felt a warmth in her heart, the kind of warmth that comes from being supported when the world seems against you. Over the next few days, Tom and Emily continued to spend time together, quietly building a bond that was noticeable but not loud. They shared simple conversations while tending to chores, walking the streets, or helping with small tasks around town. Each moment strengthened Emily's confidence. She began to smile more openly, to carry herself with a little less fear, and to believe that perhaps a future with respect and dignity was possible. However, Cedar Creek was slow to change. Gossip persisted, fueled by those who felt threatened by the disruption of old patterns. Some townsfolk tried to isolate Emily, refusing to sell her goods, avoiding conversation, or turning their backs when she walked by. It was subtle but painful, and Emily often felt the familiar sting of loneliness. But each time she faltered, Tom was there, sometimes silently, sometimes with gentle words of encouragement. "Stand tall," he would say. "They can whisper, but they cannot define you." One afternoon, a small group of younger townsfolk approached Emily and Tom while they were walking near the stables. "You two are causing a lot of talk," one said, half amused and half curious. "Don't you know the town expects certain arrangements?" Tom looked at them evenly. "And what do you think those arrangements mean?" he asked. The young man shrugged. "Just that Emily isn't the type people usually pick. You could do better, you know." Tom smiled faintly, not mockingly, but with a quiet firmness. "I don't choose people based on what others say. I choose them for who they are, for their courage, for their heart." Emily felt a surge of pride. She had been treated as unworthy for so long, and yet here was someone who saw her fully. Not her past, not the rumors, not the whispers, just her. It was an entirely new feeling, and one she wanted to protect. She realized that courage could inspire courage, and the calm strength of Tom's choices was giving her the strength to stand taller, speak firmer, and hope more freely. But life in Cedar Creek was never simple. One morning, Emily discovered that someone had tampered with the small garden behind her home. Plants had been trampled and some vegetables ruined. She knew immediately that it was not an accident. Her heart sank, but she did not show defeat. Instead, she went to Tom. "They're trying to make me feel small again," she said softly. Tom placed a hand on her shoulder. "They can try, but it won't work," he said. "You've survived worse. This town is learning that they cannot control your strength or my respect for you." They worked together to repair the garden, side by side, quietly teaching a lesson in resilience. Emily noticed that the act of standing firm, even in the face of quiet sabotage, was changing her perspective. She realized that fear and shame only had power if she allowed them to. And with Tom's support, she felt an unspoken promise that she was no longer alone. Word of their quiet resilience began to spread, and not all of it was negative. A few townsfolk who had been neutral or curious began to reconsider their assumptions. They watched the courage and quiet dignity of Emily and the calm determination of Tom, and slowly some began to speak differently. "Perhaps she's stronger than we thought," one woman murmured. Another man nodded silently, seeing the truth without words. Change, even in a small town like Cedar Creek, was slow, but it was beginning. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Tom and Emily sat on a wooden bench near the edge of town. The air was cool, and the sky glowed with the fading light. "You've changed me," Emily said quietly. "I didn't realize I could feel this confident, this strong again." Tom smiled. "No one can take away what's inside you. I just helped you see it. The rest has always been yours." She nodded, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. The town's judgment still lingered, but it no longer felt like a cage. The following week, a few of the town's younger families approached Emily with small gestures of friendship. A shared loaf of bread, a kind word, a nod of recognition. The change was subtle but real. Cedar Creek was beginning to see her not as a subject of gossip, but as a person worthy of respect. And through it all, Tom remained by her side, not as a hero, but as someone who refused to let injustice go unchallenged. Even Clara, the town's perfect young woman, approached Emily quietly one afternoon. "I see what he sees," she admitted softly. "You're stronger than I thought." Emily nodded, unsure how to respond. There was no anger, only a quiet acknowledgement that even the town's expectations could be challenged. Small bridges were being built, one conversation at a time. By the end of the week, the town square felt different. The whispers had not vanished completely, but they had less power. Emily walked with her head held high, carrying the quiet confidence that came from surviving, standing firm, and being recognized by someone who truly saw her. Tom walked beside her, calm and observant, knowing that change was never immediate, but that courage and patience could slowly shift even the hardest hearts. Life in Cedar Creek was far from easy, but Emily and Tom had begun to carve a path that was theirs alone. Each day brought new challenges, gossip, judgment, subtle resistance, but also new victories. A kind gesture, a smile from someone who once whispered, a small acknowledgement that courage and truth mattered. And through it all, their bond grew stronger. Not through drama or grand gestures, but through quiet respect, shared strength, and the knowledge that they were no longer defined by the town's expectations. As night fell and stars glittered above Cedar Creek, Emily felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The town had not fully changed, but she had. And Tom's steady presence reminded her that standing firm, even in the face of resistance, could eventually inspire change. For both of them, life was no longer just about surviving. It was about living with dignity, courage, and a shared hope that even the smallest acts of defiance could grow into something meaningful. The early morning sun spilled over Cedar Creek, casting long shadows across the dusty streets and wooden buildings. Life in the town had begun to settle into a new rhythm, quieter and gentler in some ways, though not without its old undercurrents. Tom Reynolds walked along the main street, taking in the familiar sights: the general store with its neatly stacked goods, the blacksmith hammering steadily at his forge, and the children laughing as they chased one another past the town square. Everything seemed ordinary, yet the ordinary had changed, subtly, because of choices made and courage shown in the weeks that had passed. Emily Harper emerged from her modest home, carrying a basket of fresh vegetables from the small garden she had rebuilt with Tom's help. The garden had survived, a quiet symbol of resilience in a town that had once tried to diminish her. She paused for a moment, looking at the rows of green shoots that had begun to flourish. Each plant, small but alive, reminded her of the strength she had discovered within herself. She breathed deeply, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face, and knew that the quiet courage she had practiced every day had finally begun to pay off. Tom appeared beside her, his presence calm and reassuring. "Good morning," he said, tipping his hat slightly. Emily smiled. "Morning," she replied. The simplicity of the greeting was enough, no need for grand words or declarations. They both understood the weight of the days they had shared, the subtle victories and quiet battles that had defined their time together in Cedar Creek. Life had not become easy. The town still whispered, still watched, and occasionally judged. But the power of those whispers had diminished. People had begun to see Emily differently, not because of her past or any rumor, but because of the unwavering respect she carried and the courage she displayed. Even those who had once been critical began to offer small gestures of kindness. A loaf of bread left at her door, a nod of acknowledgement in the street, a quiet smile in passing. It was not dramatic, but it mattered. Each small act of recognition reinforced what Emily had learned. Her worth was not determined by others, but by the strength of her character. Tom and Emily walked together toward the town square, where the familiar bustle of daily life continued. Shopkeepers greeted them politely, children waved, and even some of the townsfolk who had once whispered behind closed doors now offered polite acknowledgement. It was not complete acceptance, but it was progress. And for Emily, it was a testament to the fact that courage and persistence could indeed bring change, even in a place that had seemed rigid and unyielding. As they approached the saloon, they noticed Clara standing nearby, watching them with a thoughtful expression. There was no resentment in her eyes, only understanding. She had seen what Tom had seen, that strength and courage mattered more than outward appearances or the town's narrow definitions of respectability. "Good morning," Clara said quietly, offering a polite nod to Emily. Emily nodded in return, feeling a sense of reconciliation. The past rivalries and judgments seemed smaller now, overshadowed by the quiet dignity they all shared. Inside the saloon, the townsfolk had begun to treat Emily differently. She was no longer hidden in the corners or ignored in conversation. People spoke to her politely, included her in discussions, and in some cases even sought her opinion on matters of the town. The shift was subtle yet unmistakable. It was the result of weeks of consistent courage, Emily's and Tom's combined, and the understanding that judging someone unfairly reflected more on the observer than on the observed. That evening, the town held a small gathering to celebrate the arrival of spring, a simple festival with music, dancing, and food. Tom and Emily attended together, walking through the crowd with quiet confidence. They didn't need to announce themselves or make grand gestures. Their presence alone spoke volumes. People who had once whispered now smiled, some hesitantly, some more openly, and even those who had been critical remained silent, unable to deny the subtle transformation in Emily and the respect she now commanded. As the music played and the townsfolk began to dance, Tom leaned close to Emily. "Do you remember the first night we spoke in the saloon?" he asked softly. Emily nodded, a small smile crossing her face. "I thought no one would ever see me," she admitted. Tom smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "And yet here you are, stronger than ever. The town is learning what I've always known, that your worth isn't defined by their whispers." Emily looked around at the faces in the room. Some still carried doubt, some were indifferent, but many had softened. She realized that change didn't happen all at once, and it wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it came quietly, through small acts of courage, consistency, and truth. And in that realization, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had survived, she had stood tall, and she had inspired recognition not through words or anger, but simply by being herself. Tom and Emily stepped outside later, walking beneath the stars. The town was quiet, the sounds of the festival fading in the distance. "Do you ever think about the future?" Emily asked. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. Tom looked at her, his eyes steady and calm. "All the time," he replied, "and I see it with you. Whatever happens, I know we'll face it together. That's what matters most." Emily felt a warmth in her chest, a feeling of safety and hope she had not known in years. The town could continue to whisper, to judge, and to challenge them, but together they were unshakable. Their bond was built not on convenience or popularity, but on respect, trust, and shared courage. She realized that the love they had developed was different from what the town expected. It was deeper, grounded in understanding and honesty rather than appearances or social expectation. Over the following weeks, Cedar Creek continued to change subtly. People became more willing to see beyond rumor and surface appearances. They began to treat Emily with kindness, if cautiously at first, and some even came to admire the strength she had demonstrated. Tom continued to stand quietly beside her, not as a hero, but as a partner who refused to let unfairness go unchallenged. Together, they had set an example of dignity, patience, and the power of quiet courage. One afternoon, as Emily tended her garden, she noticed several townsfolk approaching with baskets of supplies and small gifts, food, flowers, even tools for her garden. "We thought you might like these," one said, smiling shyly. Emily's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of gratitude. She had endured so much to get to this point, and now she was beginning to see that people could change, even if slowly, and even if only in small ways. Tom stood beside her, smiling quietly, proud not just of her, but of the subtle transformation in the town. By the end of spring, Emily Harper was no longer defined by whispers or judgment. She was seen as a strong, capable woman, deserving of respect, friendship, and love. Tom Reynolds had chosen her not because of what the town said or expected, but because he recognized her true character, the courage, kindness, and quiet strength that had always been there. Their relationship had become a quiet symbol for the town, showing that judgment could be overcome, that prejudice could be challenged, and that love based on truth and respect could thrive even in difficult circumstances. One evening, as they watched the sun set behind the hills, Tom turned to Emily. "We've come a long way," he said softly. Emily nodded, her heart full. "We have," she replied. "And I feel like we've finally found our place, not just with each other, but in this town." Tom smiled. "It's not the town that defines us, it's how we choose to face life together." Emily leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the calm strength of his presence. She thought back to the first days she had endured Cedar Creek's judgment, to the whispers and quiet cruelty she had faced, and realized how far she had come. She had been broken in the eyes of the town, but not in reality. With courage, patience, and the support of someone who truly saw her, she had not only survived, but had flourished. Tom and Emily's life in Cedar Creek continued with quiet determination. They worked together, laughed together, and faced challenges together. Their bond became a model of love rooted in respect, courage, and understanding. The town, while slow to change, gradually recognized that true worth was measured not by rumor or appearances, but by strength of character. People began to treat each other with a little more kindness, inspired by the quiet example set by Tom and Emily. Years later, when townsfolk spoke of the couple, they spoke not of scandal or whispers, but of respect, love, and courage. Emily Harper, once the subject of judgment, had become a symbol of resilience. Tom Reynolds had proven that love and respect could triumph over prejudice, and that one person's courage could inspire change in an entire community. As the sun set over Cedar Creek once more, casting golden light across the streets and hills, Emily and Tom stood together, watching the town that had tested them so deeply. They did not need words to describe what they had accomplished. Their hearts, their shared experiences, and their quiet victories spoke for themselves. And in that moment, they knew that love, courage, and truth had won, not in dramatic fashion, but through the steady, patient work of living with integrity and respect.